Здравствуйте, товарищ. I'm History with Hilbert, and this is a video all about the Ruske Revolution, or Russian Revolution. Today, Russia is called the Russian Federation, and has a semi-presidential system in which a president or head of state is elected by popular vote, as well as having a cabinet and not being incredibly centralized. However, in my parents' generation, and in many of your generations, the state in Russia was called the Soviet Union, or officially the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, this wasn't just Russia, but included other countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and many others, which were all apparently on equal footing with Soviet Russia, and this was called the United Soviet Socialist Republic, often shortened to USSR, a highly centralized communist state which was in place. Now, before this, you had the Russian Empire, which was very different and had a Tsar, which was essentially equal to a king or an emperor in charge of the country, a very autocratic system with a ruling elite and a lot of people under that kept in check by the army. So while this video is going to be about the Russian Revolution, or should I say revolutions, as there were two, one in February and one in November, these occurred in 1917. But before I get onto that, I'd like to cover another rebellion or revolution which took place in 1905, as many of the causes for that are going to be important for what we're talking about. So I'd like to start off by looking at the term serf. Now, a serf is an agricultural labourer bound by the feudal system who was tied to working on his lord's estate. And you might have come across this term before when looking at the Middle Ages, the feudal system in England or France in, say, the 14th century, because this was essentially the way of life for many agricultural labourers throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. But in Russia, this carried on right the way up into the 19th century. It was only abolished in 1863. Now, an interesting parallel to draw here is that at the time of the abolition of serfdom, as it was sort of a type of slavery, because people didn't own the land they were working on, they had to pay rent and farm it for whoever owned the land. It's a similar situation to slavery in the United States, and obviously in 1865, after the American Civil War, all the slaves were freed as well. And you get problems there, which I have studied, just as you get problems with the serfs, because they were suddenly made free and the whole system changed, but then they had no real idea of what to do with that, or, you know, if they'd only known the system of serfdom or slavery their entire lives, they didn't know how to go out and live in the world, essentially. In Russia, the situation's a bit different. While serfdom was officially abolished, things remained very difficult and very hard for people living under the autocratic Tsarist regime. And these people often were starving, they didn't have a lot of food, they were often discriminated against by the system. And this is one of the reasons why it was Russia where communism first really took hold, where these drastic land reforms took hold, because the land distribution and the system were so brutal under the Tsar. Now, another reason why people were unhappy in 1905 and rose up is that the Russian government, the Tsar, wanted a sense of Russification. And as you can see here, this is a map of the languages in Russia. Now, these are only the main languages in Russian. Obviously, you have Russian as well, but these are different languages spoken by various ethnic groups, of which there are many. There are many more languages. These are just some of the main ones, just to show how diverse a country Russia is. But the Tsar wanted to centralize power and to essentially enforce the Russian, the Slavic way of life onto different people, and this obviously annoyed people because there are far more non-Slavic people in Russia than there are Slavic people in Russia, so this also caused annoyance in people. And in 1905, some of these factors, as I have mentioned, they all boiled up, and this caused the people to rise up. Now, where did they rise up? They rose up in a city called Petrograd, but we know it today as St. Petersburg. And a lot of the action that happens both in 1905 and in 1917 indeed does take place in Petrograd. Now, the Russians had been fighting a war in the east in 1905 called the Russo-Japanese War, which is a very interesting conflict where the Japanese, who are a fledgling empire just sort of finding their feet after the fall of the samurai and things like that, actually managed to defeat the Russian Empire in this war. And the first signs of the revolution of 1905 was at the Putilov plant, which was a railway and artillery supplier in St. Petersburg. And what went from a few workers refusing to work soon escalated to hundreds of thousands of workers in almost 400 factories in Petrograd refusing to work. Now, this then escalated to the point where there were hundreds of thousands of people who marched to the Winter Palace, which was the president's palace, not with the aim of killing him or overthrowing the government or anything like that, but with a manifesto that they wanted him to sign. They obviously wanted change. But what happened instead was that Tsarist Russian troops were lined up outside the palace and they fired into the crowd. I think they killed several hundred people during the time, and this event became known as Bloody Sunday. Now, there was also another Bloody Sunday, I think that was 1975, which was in Northern Ireland, very famous, and if I remember correctly, there are about 20 different historical events called Bloody Sunday. Bad things always seem to happen on Sunday. And there are also two Nights of the Long Knives, one in Nazi Germany in 1934, which was a purge Hitler did against the Sturmabteilung, and one in the middle of the 5th century, which was when the Anglo-Saxons under Hengstenhauser killed the Brittonic leaders under the stones of Stonehenge. But that's a bit of extra trivia for you. 1905 Bloody Sunday caused absolute outrage in Russia, and before long over half of all Russian workers were on strike, and also in other areas controlled by the Russian Empire, like Poland for instance, this was much higher, as they were also annoyed about the system of Russification, which forced them, essentially it downplayed their language and culture, as well as the various other ethnic groups, including Muslim ones, in Russia at the time. And essentially lots of people went on strike, lots of very important people in industry, for example, and they formed barricades across the street. Now, it wasn't just people in industry, but dangerously enough for the Russian authorities, it was also lots of people in the army and the navy. Now, it's interesting to draw a comparison here, because if we look at the November Revolution in 1919 in Weimar Germany, we see as well that there are dissenting army and especially navy units, which are essentially very left-wing units, which also refuse. For example, the 1919 October or November Revolution, in Weimar Germany, or what would become Weimar Germany, started in Kiel, which was also with sailors. So it's interesting to see that it's the same groups in the different countries which often start the way they do. Now, this obviously caused the government some alarm, so much so that they actually drafted the October Manifesto. And the October Manifesto granted freedoms of speech, conscience, assembly, and association. Now, most people will know what freedom of speech is. It's essentially, in some way or another, being allowed to say what you like without being discriminated against. Obviously, there are different rules and extensions, clauses attached to that depending on where you are. Now, freedom of conscience is essentially freedom of religion in a simple, downplayed way. It's freedom to think what you like. Freedom of assembly is freedom to meet up in groups, to strike, etc., that kind of thing. And freedom of association is essentially being allowed to be part of various groups, for example, political parties, probably in this case. But again, obviously it depends on where you are. Here, for example, you wouldn't be allowed to be part of a terrorist cell. That's obviously not counted, but that's essentially the vague meaning of it. Now, there was an establishment of a Duma. I think, if my Russian serves me correctly, Duma means house or something like that, but essentially it was a parliament which would hold legislative power and be democratically elected by the people. And who could elect them? Well, all males could elect them in Russia, so that was democratic change for the better. Now, an important distinction which I will make later on as well in Russia is that not everyone was a hardline communist. In fact, most people at this point, 1905, wouldn't have been communist, and the term wasn't a very popular one. And the liberals, who just wanted change in a normal way, they were happy with this, and they said okay and stopped striking. It was only the hardline radical socialists, left-wingers, Marxists, people who would become communists, who carried on, but they were crushed by the army at this point. And this is essentially the end of the 1905 revolution. Let's fast forward to 1914, which is a very important year because it's the start of the First World War. And Russia during the First World War was on the side of France and Britain and another country. Pitted them first against the German and Austrian empires and later against the Ottoman Empire as well. Now, the Western Front is the very famous one with the trenches, and it wasn't very mobile. That's the famous one in the First World War. But there was, I should say, also an Eastern Front in the First World War, which consisted mainly of Russian attacks against the Germans and against the Austro-Hungarians, in often support of some of the Baltic states in the region, who were also attacking and on various sides in the war. Now, the Eastern Front was a very mobile front. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of ground were covered, unlike the Western Front, which was mobile for the first few weeks of 1914 and then hardly moved right up until the end in 1918, and even then it hardly moved more than a few miles at a time, to be honest. Now, in the Eastern Front, the Russians had a lot more men than both the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, but they made an absolute mess of it. As in, here we can see the map of the First Battle of Tannenberg, which is, you probably have heard the name because it's such a famous battle which the Germans won. The Germans had about half the strength of the Russian army, but they managed to inflict a huge amount of casualties on the Russian army and take many more of them prisoner, all the while driving the Russians back. Now, this was just the First Battle of Tannenberg. An equally climactic victory would be the German victory at the Battle of the Syrian Lakes, which was also a huge victory for the Germans. And the war goes very poorly for the Russians because they just aren't organised enough. Their leaders just weren't as good as the very famous duo. Obviously, you've got Hindenburg and Ludendorff. I think it was Hindenburg who won at the Battle of Tannenberg, but essentially the important message to take from this is that the Russians did very poorly at the start of 1914, which is when the Battle of Tannenberg was, and the Battle of the Syrian Lakes. Now, because of these failures, the Tsar, remember this leader figure in Russia who was Tsar Nicholas II at this point, took personal control of the Russian army, but this only made matters worse. And this didn't just make matters worse because he was a poor tactician and didn't really know what he was doing, especially not in military matters. It also made matters worse because then people could actually physically blame him, and they were right to blame him, for the further defeats in the war as 1915 and 1916 came along. Now, to make matters worse, Tsarina Alexandra, who was his wife, was German, or I think half German. Certainly made matters worse by being very close to a certain figure who will remain nameless, although his initials these were just some of the issues that were bothering Russian people in the onset of 1917. Other ones included food shortages in all the major cities, blockading of major trade lanes in the Dardanelles with the entry of the Ottomans into the war. If you think about Russia, one of their greatest problems in history, and indeed now, is having warm water ports, which are essentially ports where they can send ships out that won't be blocked with ice, because if you think about Russian geography, they hardly have any outlets into the sea, despite how large they are. And when I say the sea, I mean obviously the sea leading into Europe, so the Baltic, that area. With the Ottomans, they had one area, which is the Crimea, which is also interesting today because obviously they've recently, what's a non-politically loaded term, reacquired Crimea. But obviously the Ottomans, which were Turkey, they then blocked that through the Dardanelles Straits, which are the straits which go through sort of where Constantinople is. That was a big deal in World War I, because then the Russians could no longer, and the Allies could no longer have this link between through the Crimea, through the Dardanelles, through those straits, because the Ottomans could block it very easily, which they did. Of course, you also have inflation because the Russians were obviously spending a lot of money and resources on the war effort, so they printed more money. Again, comparison to Weimar Germany, the Weimar Republic did this, and this led to huge problems. Of course, also you've got the actual physical loss of hundreds of thousands of men on the Eastern Front. This was a hugely damaging thing that was happening, obviously emotionally damaging, but physically as well. If you've got hundreds of thousands of men, obviously Tannenberg, you had 150,000 men being lost. That was a huge amount of men. That's a huge blow on the labour force as well. So you've got to bear that in mind, as well as then the Tsar refusing to approve further liberalising social reforms, which would be helping people get through this, but instead it's just the same old authoritarian system. So this really does annoy people. Now, this is quite an oversimplified way to look at this. You can sort of split the Russians at this point into a few groups. Now, these are very oversimplified groups, so please don't comment, oh, Hilbert knows nothing, you are a noob, doesn't even know what this means. This is just to sort of help to break down, because it's a very complex situation. Now, at the time, you've got a few different groups. Obviously, you've got people who would support the Tsar. They would be very high class. The church, the clergy, obviously the Orthodox Church in Russia at the time, they were mostly in support of the Tsar because they held quite a lot of power at the time. Now, then you've also got the liberals who I've put in. They are essentially, they can be any sort of stripe of liberal, so anything from being a moderate socialist, that would be a sort of liberal standpoint, the SPD in Germany at the time, again Weimar, bringing that in because I've made videos about that. And then on the other side I've put communists. Now, in Russia, these groups generally had different names, and I've put them down as the more right-wing conservative elements. Tsarists, obviously in favour of the Tsar. Now, the more liberal forms I've put as Mensheviks. Now, whether they are liberal, they would today be classed probably as quite far left, but in Russia they were the more liberal of the reformers at the time. Menshevik is Russian for minority, because later on they would become a minority, and I've put them in white for another reason which will become clear as the video goes on. And essentially they were more in form of democratic change, slowly implementing socialist policies, whereas on the far left I've put the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik means the majority in Russian, so you can see the distinction between Menshevik and Bolshevik, and obviously in red because red is the colour of communism. Now, the Bolsheviks are a party that would form a bit later on. There weren't really that many Bolsheviks to begin with. This became a lot more popular, but essentially red I've put down for the more radical communist reformers who wanted an armed takeover and an immediate implementation of land and social reforms, unlike the Mensheviks who were more in favour of democratic process of instating a socialist system. But it gets quite complicated from here. So essentially what happens is that in February of 1917 all of these issues come to a head, and this is the start of what's called the February Revolution, and this once again took place in St. Petersburg, which was at the time the capital of the Russian Empire, and also where the Tsar and his family had the Winter Palace and where they resided. Just like in the revolution of 1905, things start very similarly. Again, it's at the Putilov plant where the first revolutionary talk starts to happen, and soon enough there are hundreds of thousands of people once again striking on the streets of St. Petersburg. Now, the next day was International Women's Day, and there were already meetings and rallies held for that. Now, these meetings supported things like having bread to be distributed through the population, because obviously at this time, 1917, it was 3 years into the war, and people were very hungry in Russia, obviously a large population and not much food coming through, a lot of it going to the army. And before long, a lot of the city of St. Petersburg had been closed down, because essentially if you think of a city and you think all the workers who ensure that everything is kept open, people making food, the transport, banks, electricity, water, that kind of thing, if they all stop doing their jobs, go on strike, you can shut down an entire city. And that's essentially what they do in St. Petersburg. Now, in other cities, people also start to rise up and to strike in various groups. Now, of course, the Tsar, who is leading the Russian army at this point, he has troops in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and he looks at them, but they were mostly wounded men who'd been sent home from the front, and only about a tenth or maybe 20% of the men would actually be fit for service. Nonetheless, he does send out the troops, but the troops are very reluctant to go out. Obviously, in a lot of the army were quite left-wing themselves. When I say the army, I mean the rank and file, not the officers. The officers generally tended to be fairly conservative, whereas the general, essentially the privates, the actual men going out and doing the fighting, tended to be quite left-wing, as they were in Weimar Germany. And actually, when the Tsar sent them out, a lot of these troops actually mutinied against the Tsar and against the Russian state and joined in the protests, which was the opposite of what he wanted to happen. Now, the Tsar, seeing things were going really badly, took a train back to St. Petersburg, but on the way he was stopped by revolutionaries, and essentially he and his army chiefs, he agreed that it was better to abdicate the throne because the situation was becoming untenable for Tsar Nicholas II, and that's the abdication of the last Russian Tsar. Now, at the same time, you have this thing which is very important called the Petrograd Assembly. Obviously, Petrograd is the old name for St. Petersburg. And essentially what this was the forming of a Soviet. Now, a Soviet is an elected local district or national council. And obviously the word Soviet is later used for Soviet Russia, and that's because these Soviets, these councils, started to appear all the way through Russia. Now, often they would be by preoccupation, so you'd have soldiers' councils, you'd have workers' councils, industrial workers, sailors' councils, that kind of thing. They appeared in Weimar Germany as well. I know I keep mentioning it, but it's an interesting comparison. And this Petrograd Assembly essentially is one of these Soviets where the workers aim to seize the means of production, and by standing together, by striking, refusing to do things, they essentially want to get change done by doing that. Needless to say, the Petrograd Soviet was a very left-wing organization, a lot of Bolsheviks under them and hard left-wingers in the organization. But at the same time, the Duma, the parliament that had been formed after the October Manifesto in 1905, actually assumed control of the government. And this group would become called the Russian Provisional Government. Provisional, essentially a temporary thing, the one used after the abdication of the Tsar. They were the ones who took control. And they were more of a liberal kind of thing. So if you think, again, back to Weimar Germany, it's like the Weimar Republic being established afterwards. They were mostly liberal, softly left-wing, that kind of idea, whereas the Petrograd Soviet are the hardline, hard leftists. Now, it's interesting because you come to a stage in the history of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Remember, this is the February Revolution, which has just occurred, which was the toppling of the Tsar, the creation of the Russian Provisional Government, and the creation of the Petrograd Soviet. And then you get that the Russian Provisional Government are ruling in the Winter Palace. And the funny thing is that in one wing of this palace you have the meeting of the Russian Provisional Government, and in the other wing you have the meeting of the Petrograd Soviet. So they are both meeting in the same building and essentially sharing power in such a way, although it is slightly more complicated. Now, the Petrograd Soviet, or the Petrograd Soviet of Workers, as they call themselves, their goals were a little bit different. They weren't trying to wrest control. It's not like there was a civil war at this point. They didn't want to rule over all of Russia, but they claimed to represent the working and lower classes. They wanted to exert their influence and put pressure on the bourgeoisie, who they hoped would rule and implement social change, often because they were being influenced by the Petrograd Soviet, on the Russian Provisional Government, who obviously was actually ruling Russia, and to uphold the interests of the workers. They also wanted to push for further democratic reforms, the formation of a full republic, the overthrow of the monarchy, full religious and ethnic liberation from persecution, and essentially other socialist and liberal ideals. Now, the Russian Provisional Government had different aims. They, of course, were the successors to the Tsarist regime, and they had to rule Russia effectively after the sudden collapse of the monarchy. Things were still pretty difficult, and the country was in a weak state at the time, not to mention still at war. They also wanted to balance the desires of both the far left revolutionaries, obviously in the Petrograd Soviet, the liberals, who were mostly made up in the government, and the conservative right. Of course, you had all these people who supported the old Tsarist regime, the religious, for example, the heads of the army, that kind of thing, following the shift of power. Now, to halt the further spread of the revolution and to stop the Petrograd Soviet from influencing the government with the aim of avoiding a power-sharing agreement with the Soviet. Obviously, the Russian Provisional Government didn't want the Petrograd Soviet whittering in their ear and trying to implement socialist change when they were the ones ruling the country, not the Petrograd Soviet. But this leads to a state called Dva vlasti in Russian, which means dual power. And this was essentially a power-sharing agreement, essentially what the provisional government didn't want to happen, did happen. They did end up sharing power, because while the Russian provisional government was essentially the ruling Russia, what the Petrograd Soviet had was that all of these Soviets, these councils of workers across the country, had a huge amount of power, because if they didn't agree with something the Russian provisional government did, they said, okay, well, we're going to turn the power off and see how long you last. And because they were spread out all the way, especially in industrial cities, they just couldn't do this. Now, the biggest pitfall all, the biggest stupid thing that the Russian Provisional Government did was carry on the war. And this meant that the hardline leftists had an easy target because pretty much everyone in Russia at this point wanted the war to end, but the Russian Provisional Government kept it up. Now, it's important we focus in on a leader of the Russian Provisional Government called Alexander Kerensky. And he was a Menshevik, I believe, and I've put him down as being a cross between a liberal and more of a hard leftist, although he did become the Prime Minister of the Russian Provisional Government. This made it very easy for the new leader of the Bolshevik Party, a certain Vladimir Lenin, to rally support against him, and the membership of the Bolshevik Party increased rapidly when he became the leader. Now, it's in this context that we have to look at the next significant event which took place, and this is the July Days, or the so-called July Days, in which there was a sort of rioting and unrest again in St. Petersburg, which was essentially the Soviets trying to wrest control of the government. Now, what actually happened was that the Provisional Government, launched an attack on Germany, and because the attack failed so badly, the sailors, the Kronstadt sailors, who were very revolutionary also in 1905, they mutinied, executed many of their followers, and this led others to start rising up, thinking this is the sign of the Great Revolution. But the army stepped in, they fired onto the crowds, and the July Days Revolution, as it became known, failed. Because of the failure, Lenin fled to, I think it was Finland, and the other leaders went into hiding or were arrested by the government. It's while Lenin is in exile in Finland that a General Kornilov of the Russian army attempts to capture power by instigating a state coup. Now, he sends troops to St. Petersburg to attack the provisional government, and he calls upon the Petrograd Soviet to help him do this. Now, of course, at this stage, the Bolsheviks were the largest hard left-wing majority, having overtaken the Mensheviks during 1917 in membership in both St. Petersburg and Moscow, and he calls upon the Bolsheviks to help him. But the Bolsheviks choose the other side, and it's actually because of this that his coup fails, because they were in charge. Obviously, you have all these Soviets with the workers, obviously the railroad employees, they're all left-wing, they're all part of these Soviets, and they refused to ship in the troops to the capital, so this coup fails, and it's thanks to the Bolsheviks. And because of this, Lenin realizes that the Bolsheviks are strong enough to seize power, because they have essentially just stopped a state coup led by a very high-ranking general in the army. Now, while Lenin is in Finland, he writes the very famous book State and Revolution, which would go on to be very influential in the later Leninist, especially in communist ideals. And when he returns to St. Petersburg, he has a real plan for the overthrow of the government, and he starts planning to do so, intimately planning every detail to overthrow the Russian Provisional Government. Lenin was of the opinion that St. Petersburg rising up wouldn't be enough, but he needed the two largest cities in Russia to do the same. So not only St. Petersburg, but also to have the workers of Moscow rally behind him when he attacks. And when this is clear that this would happen should a revolution start, he decides to act on his belief that they can indeed overthrow the Russian government, and he does this on the 7th of November 1917. Now, the events of the actual revolution itself seem very minuscule, but their effect was enormous on not only Russian history, but world history. On the 7th of November, a group of radical Bolshevik Marines also entered St. Petersburg, and it's at this point that Lenin calls up the Red Guard, who are essentially the armed militias that had started forming already in February of 1917. He calls them up, and they start seizing various government installations up and around the city, and actually most of the armed forces of the Russian Provisional Government don't fight back at them, but simply join them, because a lot of them were hard-wing leftists, and others of them simply couldn't be bothered to fight for their government that they hardly felt any connection with. So you see that the Red Guards, the socialists, the communists, take most of the city without much of a fight. In fact, the only areas that needed much fighting at all to capture was the Winter Palace, and that was actually defended by a female battalion of the Provisional government. They were the only ones willing to fight back against the Red Guards. Now, Kerensky did actually manage to escape. He escaped in, I think it was a car, obviously from the American embassy, because obviously all the railways around the place they were controlled by the Soviets, so they would simply give him over to the Red Guards. But essentially, Petrograd, St. Petersburg falls without much of a fight. Now, later on in Soviet propaganda, this would be made out to be a huge and spectacular battle that the communists have to fight their way through every street. But actually only around 10 people died, and there were a few more wounded, and that was about it. That was the November Revolution. But in the Russian calendar, because they still use I believe the Justinian calendar, that was the October Revolution. So if you've ever seen the film Hunt for Red October, the Red October is obviously red because it's the Soviets, the communist, and October because that's the date of the revolution. You also have the very famous factory where there were a lot of various skirmishes and battles fought in Stalingrad, which was also called the Red October because obviously in the Russian system this was the October Revolution rather than the November Revolution, which is with our calendar system. Now, what were the immediate causes of the revolution? Well, straight away after the revolution, the fighting doesn't end. You get a period known as the Russian Civil War. Now, this was a civil war not as in that there were two sides fighting each other. There were lots of different people fighting each other, and I could do a whole other video on the Russian Civil War. But essentially, you get a coalition of anti-Bolsheviks who are known as the White Russians, the White Movement, which is also Belarusia, for example, is Bielo in Russian, is white. So that's White Russia, that's the remnant of that, essentially. You get this coalition of various people. So you have some liberals in that, you have some ex-Tsarists, churchmen, Cossacks, things like that, formed the White Russians, and they fought against, obviously, the Red Russians, so the communists, as well as various other groups. A lot of the aforementioned ethnic and national groups also sought independence during this time. They thought, well, they're all fighting each other, so might as well declare independence. And, for example, Poland successfully did this at the time, which is why the Soviets in the wake of the Second World War were so eager to get back at the Poles. That's one of the reasons why. So you get the Russian Civil War during this period. Now as well, obviously, you get the things like private property and banks being nationalized, wages being raised, working hours being shortened, other things like land distribution, food distribution, that kind of thing. So essentially your classic Marxist, communist rules, laws being implemented onto the country. And of course you get the formation of the United Socialist Soviet Republic, or USSR for short, which was formed obviously after the Bolsheviks were victorious, after they were successful. And of course this then led to lots of other things that have influenced our world today. So one of the direct causes was soon after the October Revolution, you get the murdering of the whole Romanov, of the whole Tsars family. They were all murdered, including the famous Princess Anastasia, who you might have seen the film about. There was a Disney film about, and there's all these rumours that she escaped and whatnot, but she probably was killed along with her family. Obviously, the spread of communism massively influenced the Second World War. That was one of the reasons just mentioned why they invaded Poland and why Hitler wasn't a massive fan of communists, as you may well know. But also then influenced things that were very important in my parents' generation. For example, the split of East and West Germany, the Iron Curtain, this whole divide between the East and the West, the Eastern Bloc. Obviously, of course, as well, because Russia became communist, they started to spread the ideas of communism around the world to China, to Korea, and to Vietnam. So that you can thank the Russian Revolution for the Vietnam War, because without this spread of communism, then no communism would ever have come to Vietnam. It's very unlikely. And of course, also the more sinister side of it, communism is it's the reason why hundreds of millions of people have been killed in brutal dictatorships and regimes throughout the world. So those are just some of the things that the Russian Revolution caused, and obviously these are massive things that still influence pretty much all of our lives today. So I realize this has been a very long video, and I apologize, but I hope it's been interesting at the same time. I would try to shorten it down, but I think to do the Russian Revolution justice, because it's such a complicated affair, you have to sometimes make slightly longer videos. So even though most people will have stopped watching by this point, if you're still watching, good on you, thank you. And don't forget to comment below. I am a real History with Hilbert fan, a true subscribbler. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share any interesting information you might know in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Thanks for watching. I'm History with Hilbert, and I will see you later.